If it weren't for Tracy Chapman, Kathleen Folbigg would still be in prison. For 20 years, she's campaigned for Folbigg's release. And for much of that time, the task seemed impossible.
Come back here. What's that?
Did you ever think of giving up?
Giving up? No, not really. Never. No. Good girl, Tara. There you go, honey. It's like, you know, all the animals I rescue. Just because you turn away doesn't mean it's not happening.
Tracy has a deep affinity with animals. She plans to build a sanctuary for abandoned creatures here in the New South Wales hinterland. Now it will also be a sanctuary for the woman abandoned to a cruel fate by the criminal justice system. Are you afraid of how difficult it's going to be to look after her once she is free?
I'm not afraid of that because I believe our friendship is so strong. She always wanted to be part of my family and she finally gets her wish.
Growing up together in Newcastle, Kathleen was an extension of Tracy's large family. Did you ever think she had killed her children?
No. No, it never made sense to me. No. The person that I knew loved being around my family. There were 4 of us as siblings. We fought all the time, pulled each other's hair, you know, but she loved all of the arguments and everything, just wanting to be part of something. So for me, she finally had got what she always wanted. So it was quite heartbreaking in reality to see that she couldn't hold that.
Their lives went in different directions when Tracy went to uni in Sydney. They got together when Kathleen had her first child. You met Caleb, the first child. Mm-hmm. In that small time you saw her with Caleb in his very short life, what did you observe?
Oh, she loved him so much. And she was just like so gentle with him. Like I couldn't have imagined me with a child at that stage, but she was just unnatural at it. She just held him and it was beautiful. So yeah, I just saw she was finally whole. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And so seeing her described as unnatural, what was that like when you actually had a recollection of what she was like?
I couldn't even fathom that in my head because, you know, I suppose maybe after she was losing other children, she would start to feel more self-conscious about things. But at that moment when I saw her with Caleb, no, she was just so happy and, yeah, nurturing, really nurturing.
In the decades-long exchange of letters from prison, Kathleen Folbigg reveals a sensitivity profoundly at odds with the convicted killer in the public's imagination.
One day I hope to actually live. I'm not really sure I did after Caleb died. I've had years to think about all of this after all. I floated, sparks of living, Pat, Sarah, Laura. I was mother for a short while in my life, and a damn good one.
Tracy's biggest regret is that she lost touch with Kathleen in her time of greatest need. Did you feel guilty yourself that you had not been in touch with her after the babies died?
So guilty. I felt like the worst person in the world. I've abandoned my friend and I did it because my life was busy. I was studying, I was working, I was married and I have my own private issues to deal with.
Kathleen, you're innocent of these charges?
Tracy was in hospital when she heard news of Kathleen's multiple murder conviction in 2003. She overheard nurses talking about the hated child killer getting what she deserved. It spurred her into action.
I ring the jail, I make a lot of phone calls trying to work out where she is, because for the longest time no one knew where she was or how to get in touch with her or anything, and I'm not acquainted with this system at all. So yeah, eventually I track her down, or what I think I've tracked down, and I start writing to her.
Kathleen was in Silverwater prison. Over the years, they exchanged hundreds of letters.
So glad that I spoke to you today, as I always am. All good.
In her first letter, Tracy asked about the thing that bothered her most, reports from the trial of words Kathleen had written in her diaries.
everywhere I went, people were just throwing these diaries back in my face. And I just thought, there's got to be an explanation for that.
Kathleen's reply was one the jury never heard because she didn't take the stand in her trial.
This letter, it was quite a powerful letter. She says, I must say, I'm not sure whether I can explain my entries. Okay, let's see. To start with, I'll agree some of my entries sound, inverted commas, atrocious. All I can say is that at the time in question, I wasn't in a positive frame of mind. Gee, how can I explain it? They, the diaries, were used to dump every negative emotion, feeling, thought I've ever had. I didn't use them like other people to record all the joyous happenings, etc. They were a release. When you're told you have faults often enough, you end up believing them. Oh, sorry. It's hard reading this. I convinced myself that I failed as a mother, as a woman even. Try to imagine from that point of reference when reading them. I was tortured, heart smashed, no confidence in myself at all, felt stomped on, torn to pieces. I have never denied my depression. I've downplayed it, yes. Tried to ignore it, yes. Coped with it, yes.
Do you remember receiving that letter?
Yes. It was this, there's some really defining moments in our friendship. And I remember reading this letter going, I will never leave you. I will never abandon you. And I'm sorry this happened to you.
Kathleen Folbigg's diaries are held by the New South Wales inquiry into her conviction. The childlike little books have come to assume enormous importance. Without these diaries, it's highly unlikely that Kathleen Folbigg would ever have been convicted. At her trial, the prosecution told the jury they were the clearest evidence of her guilt, and her defence didn't call any expert witnesses to refute that. Only now, 20 years later, experts have examined the diaries and interpreted the words as those of a grieving mother, rather than the confessions of a murderer.
I think diaries are something very different. It's not like I'm writing my memoirs. It's different. Or I'm writing a confession. Right? Diaries is sort of a childlike dialogue with oneself. Right? The problem is that the court in the past and the judges and the prosecutors, whatever, they took those things literally.
Psychologist Kamal Tumar was one of the first experts to review the diaries. During the COVID lockdown, when he was living in the bush, Tumar drove again and again to the top of a hill to get reception to speak to Kathleen in prison. He remembers how adamant she was about the diaries.
If they want to know what my diaries mean, maybe they need to ask me, rather than tell me that they know more than me what my diaries mean.
She understood it may have been a mistake not to do that during her trial.
When my lawyers asked me did I wish to get up on a stand and testify or explain them, I sort of shook my head and sort of said, well, what's going to happen then? Am I going to have to start explaining every sentence, every word, every punctuation mark, is this going to start getting, sort of full on? And they said, most likely. And then I just went, I don't think I want to do that. Thanks very much. So,
right. But you didn't realise the implications at that time.
Didn't even really get the implications of it all until in prison on that first night, realising that, oh my God, that actually happened and now I'm here. What am I supposed to do now?
The really devastating blow to Kathleen was that no experts were called at the trial by the defence to examine these diaries. They were left unexamined by experts, And fast forward all of these years later to today, we now understand just how useful that could have been to Kathleen all that time ago. We've got these experts who are unanimously agreeing that their expert reading of the diaries are that they're not confessions of murder.
It was not until the Folbigg family suffered its fourth catastrophic loss that Kathleen was targeted by police. It was in March 1999. Laura was captured playing in the backyard pool the day before.
Ambulance emergency. I need an ambulance. My baby's not breathing. Okay, and how old's your baby? 20 months old. Can you just hold a minute? I'm trying to do CPR. 20 months old. Not getting any heartbeat or anything. Okay, do you know why this is? I've had 3 steps already. Pardon? I've had 3 go already. And your name? It's Kathy. Kathy.
The police really moved very quickly after Laura died. Of course, what was in the police's mind at the time is only known to them.
What is clear is that until Kathleen's husband Craig handed over diaries to police, they didn't have a case. Kathleen told the psychologist Kamal Toomer how much it had hurt her.
To discover that your actual husband, who you thought was being amicable, he's the one that handed the diaries in without even telling me, sort of thing. He didn't even tell me that he found one, let alone that he'd read it or didn't like what was in it.
Right.
And, yeah, so...
He was your first judge, basically.
Basically, yes, yeah. And even though we were separating at the time, we'd been separated for over 2 years before the trial sort of started. And again, I was ignorant and not realising just how cooperative he was being with the police.
For the police, the existence of the diaries was the breakthrough they needed.
Once the diaries came into play, the police rushed off to a police psychologist and basically asked this police psychologist to give them the information they needed to use these as the strongest evidence of her guilt and to pick out the entries that were most incriminating to Kathleen.
Okay, the next entry that I'd like to talk to you about is dated the 1st of January 1997.
This time I am going to call for help, and this time and not attempt to do everything myself anymore. I know that that was the main reason for all my stress before, and stress made me do terrible things.
You say there that stress made you do terrible things.
Yeah, as in have an angry thought here or there. Don't think I've met a parent that doesn't have an angry thought every now and then if the child's arguing with them or something's not going quite right or it's just not happening.
You've said, every parent feels that at some time, to some degree. And yet, children don't die of it.
They were crucial. The medical scientific evidence was important, but at the end of the day, I think the diaries put the thing beyond doubt.
Almost everyone who's come to the case has been, at least initially, disturbed by the diary entries. Emma Cunliffe wrote the first academic work questioning Folbigg's conviction. She says the prosecutors had used incriminating lines out of context.
The doubts started to creep in when I was sitting in the archives in the New South Wales Supreme Court and looked at the diaries in their totality for the first time and realised 2 things about them. The first was that many of the most troubling entries, which had been widely reported, had been decontextualised from the broader discussion that was present in the diary when you read it from start to finish.
Craig was pretty drunk Friday night. In his drunken stupor, he admitted that he's not really happy. And he has a morbid fear about Laura. Well, I know there's nothing wrong with her. Nothing out of the ordinary anyway. Because it was me, not them. With Sarah, all I wanted was her to shut up. And one day she did.
Those more troubling entries, when read against the backdrop of a relentless questioning of self and of family and of relationships, seemed far less striking and far less like the words of a person who had committed the acts of which she was charged.
At the 2019 inquiry into Kathleen Folbigg's conviction, Justice Reg Blanche excluded psychological expertise on the diaries. Instead, he wanted Kathleen Folbigg to explain the diaries in her own words. That happened under harsh cross-examination from hostile lawyers.
Kathleen was cross-examined first by the lawyer representing the DPP and then by the lawyer representing Craig Folbigg. And she was asked more than 70 times whether she'd killed her children.
You say it in terms. She's a fairly good-natured baby, thank goodness. It has saved her from the fate of her sibling.
Because again, it goes to my extreme view and my extreme belief that something else had taken the other three of my children.
You had?
No, not at all.
Because they weren't good-natured enough for you to. They didn't behave well enough for you not to lose it with them. That's right, isn't it?
No.
They battled your wills and they kept you from sleep. They weren't good-natured enough.
No, not at all.
And you could not tolerate them.
No, absolutely not.
And you suffocated them.
No.
The diaries were a huge part of the prosecution case. To hear at this recent inquiry from 10 experts, 3 of whom were engaged by the inquiry, that their reading, their expert reading, is that these words that Kathleen wrote are not confessions of murder, but instead grieving writings of a mother who had lost children, was a huge moment in this case. And a really pivotal, I think, to a finding by Mr. Bathurst that there is reasonable doubt.
My eternal gratitude goes to my friends and family, especially Tracy and all of her family, and I would not have survived this whole ordeal without them.
Kathleen Folbigg came home to the people who truly know her. Described now in the words of the inquiry as a caring mother for her children, to a place where she can remember them in peace.
For the last 20 years I have been in prison. I have forever and will always think of my children, grieve for my children, and have missed them and love them terribly. Thank you.